All right, well, good afternoon. Thank you all for joining today's discussion on values-based neighborhood design and development. This event is the second of 6 sessions organized by our region's county planning departments that will occur on select Thursdays through February. Our goal is to convene a diverse group of community stakeholders to learn about the Southern Tier's most pressing housing challenges. We hope these sessions will be informative, promote collaborative best practices, and facilitate equitable and sustainable solutions across the Southern Tier. This series has been designed for municipal leaders, economic developers, planning professionals, and industry partners. However, we encourage all members of our community to register and join us in this conversation. I will enter in the chat the link to our Industry Summit page where you can view upcoming sessions, and please visit our Facebook page to help share promotional posts. Before we begin, please ensure your microphone or audio is on mute. And during the panel discussion, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box. I will monitor this throughout the session. While we encourage active participation, we do expect all participants to engage in respectful dialogue. Also, if you're a municipal official seeking credit, please contact your county planning department after the event. I would now like to introduce our moderator, Beth Lucas, the Director of Planning for Broome County. Beth, thank you for volunteering to guide today's session. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Evan. Hello, everyone. Today's session will focus on homelessness, displacement, inclusive and equitable development, and more broadly, ways to advance community well-being through housing. First, let me introduce today's speakers. Jessica Gonzalez is an Inclusive Economic Development Advisor and co-program lead for the Inclusive Economic Development in EDD's COVID-19 Recovery Program at NGIN. In this role, Jessica leads a national community of practice of regional economic organizations working to implement inclusive economic strategies. Throughout her career, Jessica has dedicated her time and talent to elevating and enhancing access to resources that support the mobilization of communities pushed to the periphery and bringing them back to center. Whether navigating the complexities of gentrification and displacement in neighborhoods in her role at local initiative support corporations or leading federal grant programs at the City of Phoenix, Jessica utilizes her skills to connect hard to access resources and support to communities most in need. Jessica previously served as business librarian at Phoenix Public Library, establishing greater access points to city services that serve entrepreneurs and leading a team to launch the Hive at Central Entrepreneurial Resource Center, aiding entrepreneurs and small business owners in incubating new businesses. She holds a master's in public administration from Arizona State University and a Bachelor of Science in American Studies and Sociology from Rutgers University. She is a fellow of the Lederis Fellowship with Hispanics in Philanthropy, a fellow of Hispanic Leadership Institute with Val de Sol, and a fellow of the Starting Block Institute. Active within the local homeless services sector since 2007, Rebecca Rathmel currently serves as the housing specialist for Broome's Relocation Assistance Program, an anti-displacement initiative that provides housing search assistance and financial support to households at risk of or experiencing homelessness. Rebecca is also the owner of Process Speaks, an advocacy and consulting firm committed to assessing service providers, local government, faith-based organizations, and regional representatives in identifying and addressing issues of homelessness and housing instability. She recently served as the Street Outreach Coordinator and Housing Advocate at the YWCA in Binghamton, Continuum of Care Coordinator for the Southern Tier Homeless Coalition, and as co-chair for the Broome County Safe Housing Task Force. Guided by a commitment to individual worth and the belief that the solution to homelessness is a home, Rebecca is a persistent and passionate advocate for increased access to housing for extremely low income and vulnerable populations. So thanks for joining us, Jessica and Rebecca. Moving on, we're going to be addressing a variety of questions in relation to today's topic. Last week, we established a shared vocabulary and began discussing affordable housing. So let's start there. So the first question we're going to address, research indicates affordable housing shortages often lead to high rent burdens, overcrowding, and substandard housing. As a result, homelessness increases and more people become at risk of homelessness. Is this a trend we are seeing locally, and how do we address it? So I guess maybe, Rebecca, do you maybe want to start with that?
Sure, I'll take the local perspective. First, it's absolutely a trend that we've seen locally. It used to be that across 6 counties in the southern tier, we would see just over 300 individuals experiencing homelessness on a given night. Now we're seeing those numbers in Broome County alone. Emergency shelters are consistently at capacity. Our outreach teams report about a dozen individuals who are sleeping on our streets every night. In Binghamton, we know that over 20 households are sleeping in their vehicles across Broome County. This doesn't even include households who are doubled up with friends or family because they can't afford to cover rent on their own locally. We know there are about 500 at least of those households. In Broome, those arrangements are often not only overcrowded, but typically extremely temporary. Specifically in terms of increases that we've been able to track in Binghamton alone, we've seen a 260% increase in homelessness among school-age children since the development of BU's downtown center and the proliferation of student housing. More than anything else, these increases in homelessness in general is directly related to our local shortage of affordable housing. Broome County consistently ties Tompkins County every year for the lowest rates of available rental housing that is affordable for extremely low income residents. So we see only about 18 rental units that are available for every 100 extremely low income households in Broome. It's a, really truly just a simple supply and demand issue when we talk about housing affordability and cost burden. I mean, over 90% of Broome's lowest income residents experience unaffordable cost burden, over 80% severely so. And landlords are currently raising the rent simply because the market allows for it right now. So when we talk about cost burden, housing affordability, and the shortage specifically of what's affordable and available, we have about 8,700 extremely low income residents in Broome and only 37 affordable units, 1,500 of which are actually available.
Thanks. Jessica, is there anything you wanted to add about that, either locally or, things you're seeing in other areas kind of relating to that?
Yeah, thank you for grounding us, Rebecca, on the real aspects of what people experiencing houselessness in your region is like. At New Growth Innovation Network, so we're a national organization working to support economic development practitioners to embed inclusive economic development strategies. And in many cases, we see that there's an integration between economic development, community development, and an opportunity to align those efforts. And so when we talk about the issue of affordable housing and to house those who are houseless, the most important thing is that recognizing that the real issue is that one is an affordability issue. There is an inability for people to access and be active participants in the economy, whether that is through employment, starting a business, et cetera. Just because someone does not have a home does not mean they don't have the ability to participate in these aspects of things. What we're seeing with our work in supporting economic development districts like Southern Tier, and et cetera, is that there is a large migration of people leaving rural communities into urban cores and vice versa, even leaving regions to find better ways to find what is healthy for them. And I think the most important thing I want to take on with this question is how do we address it? And the most important thing is an open dialogue, an honest dialogue about what is happening and what is driving people into these aspects. Sometimes it could be mental health. Sometimes it could be that there isn't a support system available for them that meets their specific needs, whether that is race-based, it could be employment-based. So we see that with veterans. A lot of that could also be on a gender-based dynamic, whether it is gender identity, folks who are not in the binary spectrum, and so they experience things a lot more differently. So I think my recommendation on how to address it is there should be an honest conversation and recognizing who and who is not at the table. And this is a point where I'd love to uplift social workers who are directly working with these populations and tracking these areas and giving them space to voice, where there's probably not an opportunity where you'll see someone experiencing houselessness at that table. There's a space for social workers to help convene that dialogue.
Great, thank you. So I guess kind of to tag on to the end of some of what Rebecca was talking about as the situation now, obviously kind of, I want to say post-COVID, but I think we're still in COVID. How has the rapidly changing economic circumstances of the pandemic exacerbated persistent community challenges such as homelessness and inequality?
Again, just with the local perspective, I mean, we know that the census tracts that were most impacted by COVID-19, whether it is the number of adults who don't have healthcare or the number of adults who lost income due to the pandemic, those census tracts that were most impacted are the same tracts that have consistently demonstrated the highest risk of housing instability and the highest percentages of people of color, extremely low income households, and households who are receiving public assistance. So while those that may have a higher stability rate, higher economic class have been able to begin to move forward, whether it's resources or a level of income that allows them to do so, the hardest hit communities have simply not been able to claw back, crawl out, and have been hit the hardest consistently.
All right. So how can development strategies and approaches be structured to include vulnerable residents such as veterans, BIPOC communities, single moms, and others?
Jessica, I'll let you take that one. I've got some thoughts, but I'll switch back and forth here.
Yeah, no problem, Rebecca. So what I would say about development strategies, and I think I'm going to also weave in a portion of the previous question as well, is that I think there's something that we're not recognizing in regards to the amount of federal dollars that has been administered over the past year. And what has shed the light is that it was very difficult for local communities, and I speak from the local perspective because last year in my work in the Phoenix area was managing some of these dollars. And so there wasn't a real plug and play system to receive these dollars and actually weave them into our programs. And so when we look at development strategies, we also shed the light to realize that as we start to see that our community is shifting, we're starting to see the wealth dynamics, the value of land, the value of certain communities are shifting where we want to see more development. We want to see greater access to housing, et cetera. We started to recognize that there wasn't a clear system of how do we go about that, So a lot of the times we need to be mindful of looking at how are our local zoning, how are we managing that process and managing the way developers are able to build on our property. And then where is that integration with communities? It's important to be clear on who you're targeting and for what purposes. Black and Indigenous communities are not monolithic. So they're neither gender identities and issues that impact them. So it's important that when you're thinking about entering these communities, what is the essence of that community, what actually provides value? And in many cases, what we've seen is that the value is the culture. The culture has defined to make that community valuable. Yet when we develop on that, the first thing that leaves is the culture while the people are exiting. So when we think about development strategies, it's like, I think the miss thing that happens the most and the hardest thing for communities to think about is that community engagement strategy. What is it? What does it mean? And what is its true essence? And the hardest thing for us, especially us folks with titles, folks with power, folks in decision-making capacities, is how do we give room in these tables for the day-to-day person? How do we allow the person who may be managing a management property, maybe managing the one cultural local grocery store? And we're not talking about like the big grocery store, we're talking about like the hacienda or the bodega that's on the corner that is providing that specific cultural fruit that is part of our Christmas dinner that you don't know about, but we know that that corner store has it and we're about to put it on our plate. So it's like, how do we create the table bigger? And there's good examples out there. And I hope that through this conversation, we can share more about that.
Yeah, and I mean, in terms of community engagement as well, so often community engagement is thought of after the fact, after the contracts have been discussed or settled, after the profit potential has been analyzed, then the municipal leadership brings a project to maybe a public hearing or maybe, and it's backwards. When we're looking to engage and establish and maintain and stabilize neighborhoods and communities, that community engagement strategy needs to come first. And the effort to actually reach out to those who are going to be most impacted. And by that, I mean disrupted. I don't mean the individuals who stand to gain the most benefit from the quote unquote revitalization project, but those who are actually going to be most disrupted by this development that's being considered. We have, in Binghamton, Broome County, we have all of the information that we need locally to identify the demographics of those who are most vulnerable. In terms of housing displacement, housing insecurity, we know that low-income single-parent households, particularly those headed by Black and Brown women, are most at risk for discrimination in terms of housing access and experience the highest rates of harassment in attempting to maintain housing stability. And despite that data, and even after some of those households and women's representing those families speak out at public hearings or community gatherings, planning continues just like it was already considered, because the process is so far along already once it gets to the community engagement piece that municipal leadership often just simply continues to move forward. And it's just it's backwards in terms of, because that community piece, that cultural piece that Jessica's referencing, that is first of all extremely difficult to maintain and even have in a community where displacement is happening so frequently. And when it is occurring and there are community supports that are intrinsic and that are organic within a neighborhood, disrupting that is anti-economic development, anti-neighborhood safety. I mean, all of these things that sectors are hoping to accomplish by revitalizing urban centers simply actually ends up doing the opposite.
Thanks both of you. So housing is a community development issue that intersects with a multitude of other challenges, such as food insecurity, transportation, workforce development, and healthcare. Where do we start? I guess maybe Jessica, do you have any thoughts on that?
I love this question because it really drives to the action of what everyone on this call does every day. It really allows us to assess our systems and how do we go about implementing our programs. Because a lot of this conversation could feel very much like we're not doing enough, we're doing bad, we're falling short on community. Yet we have to recognize that this is a community too. And so the answer lies really in how your data is collected and how you're also collecting your community narratives and who experiences these issues front and center. So if you have those two metrics, if you have those two abilities, and then you find the intersection between the two, an answer does weave itself through. You just have to be intentional. And that's why it's important to have diverse team members, members who are intimate or close to your community, and or activating community review boards or community review processes, councils, et cetera, where they can help you to see if you're not able to those two intersections. And then the next step to that is an engine feels very, very strongly about this, is giving yourself grace. This is not something that you're going to be able to implement overnight. So really have an ability to create a long-term strategy, yet with incremental ways to assess your progress. And so what that looks like is I love to use, I come from an entrepreneurship background, so beta testing. Really be honest with your team and say, you know what, this is a little innovative. I may not have like the governance that supports it, but if you package it and say, you know what, I'm going to develop this pilot program. And then the most important thing that I think we fall short on is not only piloting the program, of course, adding evaluation metrics to it, but adding evaluation in between the process, 3-month markers. If you even want to be as small as like 1-month markers, and say, are we doing right? Are we doing right by this? And not just keeping it at the kitchen table, but bringing that kitchen table into the community as well. How is this feeling? How is this, is this working out for you? Do you even understand what we're doing? And in that aspect, yes, it requires a bit more transparency than what we're used to, but it also allows us to see we're not 5-6 years down the line and all of a sudden there's like a big blow up. And so by being intentional, strategic, beta testing, you'll start to see what is the answer. Do we address food insecurity first? Do we really see that there's a pathway or an issue? It may be transportation infrastructure, and then you need to tap into your regional economic development folks to say, hey, we need to solve this a little bit more intentionally. You'll start to see those things.
Yeah, I think there are absolutely intersections within these community challenges. I am always going to be one to advocate for the fact that I believe housing is the foundation when it comes to addressing these community challenges. There is not a single sector locally at any local level, whether it's education, workforce, healthcare, that can accomplish its intended outcomes unless we're stabilizing housing for community residents, not a single sector. So stabilizing housing, and addressing that by preventing the further attrition of existing affordable housing, which we've seen a great deal of across the southern tier, due largely in part, some urban revitalization, but we're in the middle of the SUNY system across the entire tier, particularly as Binghamton University expands. So doing everything we can at a municipal level legislatively to prevent further attrition, and also developing more affordable housing. Those are the two kind of basic, simple but not simple, but worth it and have to happen kind of strategies to start with.
So kind of to follow that up, so how do communities plan for and prevent direct or exclusionary displacement when undertaking these commercial development projects?
At the risk of sounding incredibly reductive, the most obvious strategy would be to not target residential properties that are currently occupied by economically vulnerable residents or who have the capacity, they're habitable enough to potentially be occupied by economically vulnerable residents. We have such a deficit, certainly in Broome County, but across the southern tier, of affordable rental units. And to implement or consider a project that would continue to remove units that are available for extremely low income housing from residents and from residential opportunities simply for commercial development is, I would use, there's a couple of terms, short-sighted, not strategic, irresponsible, depending on how often it's done. I would say certainly, institutional accountability. We have high-level players across the tier, whether it's our healthcare institutions as they expand their campuses, or our university institutions as they expand their campuses, and partnerships with those institutions where we're encouraging them to identify and acknowledge the impact that their development is having on residential stability, particularly for residents who are most vulnerable. And then together identifying a strategy moving forward that accounts for not displacing. And if displacement does for some reason have to happen, then there should be programs in place that are supporting relocation, not programs that are simply, while existing rental assistance programs are within the homeless services programs, those projects are already at capacity. So if there's a development project that needs to move forward that's going to impact residential properties that are already occupying low-income residents, then we need to provide the financial support to find them their next option so that they just don't become part of that cycle of displacement and end up on their own trying to find the next roof over their kids' heads.
Yeah, I would add also, from when planning officials are interacting with developers, I think it's fair to say that we are now at a point in time where equity measurements or equity markers can be discussed. And so what would it look like if you were to say, there's typically some level of a developer who's interested in a specific property has to engage the community, right? And then they have to come back and say, this is who we've engaged, et cetera, et cetera. So what would it look like to say, not only count how many engagements they've had, but who was actually participating in those meetings? If there's a large proportion of a racial group or a specific gender type, was that accounted for, and is that something that you report back on? In addition to that, income levels is critically important too. What parts of the community did you engage? On the other end, as a preventative measure, what would it look like for you to engage and support either like your neighborhood department, whoever engages neighborhood development, those types of neighborhood association programs, et cetera, in your local government, have some type of relationship where you're also creating some preventative measures. Are you supporting and activating support resources for those community groups to then engage themselves, to develop neighborhood leaders at the local level? Do you understand those processes and can identify those community leaders who are activating? And then, so then you're also not only trying to create those equity measurements in that for the developer to bring back to you, but then you're also supporting the community on the other end so they know how to have that conversation when they attend those meetings, and so forth. I also want to share, there's this big project that is happening in downtown Phoenix. I no longer live in the area, but so maybe that's why I can safely talk about it. There's this big project that's happening, and as I was witnessing it, it's the only part of the city where there is federally funded housing, right? There's housing that is subsidized for that community, and it has been left in decrepit, like just poor condition for years. And finally they received a choice neighborhood grant. And so it's going through development. And so, they're doing their typical like engaging plans, health assessments, et cetera. And then finally it got to the point where the developer is coming to put the shovel in the ground. And I'm at this meeting or at this like groundbreaking session, and I look and nobody who lived there was there. It was only government staff, developers who were on the project, and the financiers, whoever was financing the project. And then of course, like an elected official. And I was just like, what happened? We missed the mark. So I think that I share that story to say, like, let's not miss the mark. Let's truly inform folks so that way they're not invisible. We're proud to say that this is your property and we want to engage you and have you be a part of the process all the way through. We want you to see what this looks like. And that's how people truly understand what is happening to them. Because then the question after that was, will they come back? Yeah, you could be replacing and giving them a new spot to live, but this takes a long time. Will they even still live in your city? And then imagine the what you're losing from that, right? We have this thing where we think people are replaceable, but there is a contribution to people having. When we have someone who's lived in our community for 20 plus years because of migration or whatever, there was something special of why they stood there. So I just want to also share that front and center.
Thanks. So kind of following up, and you guys kind of alluded to some of this, but I guess we can kind of directly address it. What is gentrification and how can economic development strategies account for it? Maybe Jessica, do you want to start with that maybe on a broader scale, and then maybe Rebecca can talk a little bit about the local aspect of it.
Yeah, simply gentrification is the act, this is my definition, the act of centering economic progress over people. And that's all it is. The way it shows up in typical programming, beautification programs, historic preservation, zoning, creative placemaking. These are all tools that help enhance neighborhoods, yet they also are means to decenter and remove equity at the front and center. They're the main drivers of pushing out cultural richness of the neighborhoods, which makes these areas very vibrant and valuable, why we're even targeting these neighborhoods. And over time, reforming it to make those with higher wealth, it means to feel safe in that neighborhood. That's gentrification at the heart of it. And there is this conversation, this trending conversation that, okay, we want gentrification without displacement. That is still inequitable because what that does is it still values the economic wealth of people to then substandard, or what we think are substandard people. We have this thing that poor people are disheartening our economy when that's not the reality. So simply said, that's how I would put it.
I was looking for like a fire emoji in response to your definition, because that's perfect. I mean, prioritizing over, and you mentioned beautification projects and aesthetic purposes. I think what we've seen so often in Binghamton and Broome County in particular is communities and neighborhoods that have been historically underinvested. When they're targeted for these quote unquote revitalization projects, what's discussed is neighborhood safety for one, and also almost always aesthetic aspects, beautification. Like these houses are going to be a lot prettier after this revitalization project, and we're missing the very significant and important point that those houses are somebody's home. And what we've unfortunately seen a lot of locally is revitalization projects that are targeting residential properties that are already occupied by economically vulnerable residents. That should not even be on the table unless you're going to do a rehab that then allows those residents, if they've been displaced, to come back around and find their homes in those locations again. What we're seeing is a significant amount of public dollars that are going towards, despite the fact that we have hundreds of vacant properties, that could be utilized for rehab, that could be utilized for residential purposes. We're essentially using public dollars to displace economically vulnerable residents just in order to like put new paint and new windows on properties that are already providing the housing. So we're not creating new, as is often claimed. We're displacing the same number of residents that we're creating units for. So we're not adding anything to those deficits that are already just astronomical. I mean, we lack over 7,000 affordable rental units in Broome County for extremely low income residents. We can't be displacing residents at the same rates as we're trying to create new. I think there's very often too a separation when it comes to development, just conceptually, of the responsibility of like the public sector versus the private sector. And I think municipal leadership is often hesitant to approach the private sector with legislative protocol and are hoping that the public sector, in terms of nonprofits and state grants and federal funding, are going to be able to create enough units to meet the need. And that's just when we're not putting protocol in place and policies in place within the private market to particularly prevent attrition. I mean, again, we talk about the proliferation of student housing. We talk about, projects that are moving forward that we already know locally that we've met market demand, if not exceeded, for student housing and luxury housing, yet somehow we continue to see projects approved for those markets. Like, we've got to switch it, not only identifying and centering the voices of those who are going to be most detrimentally impacted, but what are the actual community needs, not what is the profit potential for those who are already quite comfortable, but what are the actual demonstrated community needs? I mean, that are on white paper, that have been on white paper for years. We start there and then we move forward, not the other way around.
Great. Thank you. So what is the relationship between housing stability and upward economic mobility? I don't know which one of you wants to get a start on that. Maybe Jessica?
I'm not sure if I've said many popular opinions, but I'll continue forward. So I strongly believe there's a misperception between securing a home, which is typically home ownership, is a solution to driving towards economic stability and security. Because in reality, wealth creation is still very much segregated and does not materialize the same for people of color. In particular, Black and African-American communities are the most distant from realizing true wealth in their lifetime. And so when we think about housing stability, I think it has to be comprehensive to include a rental strategy. How do we create safe and healthy abilities for people to find rental homes, but also an ability for those who are interested in home ownership, the ability to also access some of those programs that are supported from a variety of different wealth. I'm also a strong believer in tying in these programs with financial wealth building programs. And I'm being very specific. I'm not talking about financial stability programs or financial, these financial opportunity kind of programs, but really talking about wealth building. What does it look like? And also making sure that it adapts to what that individual would like to see as what they define as wealth. And so I am a believer that it should be comprehensive to not only include opportunities for wealth creation in the aspects of someone who wants to participate in the workforce, and also differently for someone who is interested in becoming a business owner, and also individuals who may want to do both. Because in reality, people of color have to be a little bit more savvy and have to be a little bit more diverse in their portfolios to see that. And so I'm not sure, Rebecca, if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, and I think too, Jessica, what you said in terms of earlier, how this isn't an overnight process. There's incredible preventive potential in stabilizing housing for children, because the strongest predictor of experiencing homelessness as an adult is having experienced homelessness and housing instability as a child. So if we look at the fact that the Binghamton City School District has a student mobility rate of 40% plus, meaning that almost half of their students are moving at least once, by our estimates, at least 3 times a year just to keep a roof over their head because of housing shortages, housing affordability issues, and housing quality concerns. That student mobility impacts significantly educational achievement. You see low academic achievement among extremely low income, frequently displaced students, chronic absenteeism. I mean, that directly impacts economic potential as they grow older. I mean, if we look at the preventive potential for communities in stabilizing neighborhoods and supporting economic opportunity, that's when it starts to all make sense for these sectors to work together and to collaborate toward development projects that no, I mean, we may not next year see the outcome, but years down the road, as we take that long-term strategic perspective, we're literally transforming opportunity for households who have historically been ignored and forgotten locally.
So, do some of the challenges that we've discussed today look different or similar in urban and rural contexts? And we talk a lot about the more urbanized area.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's not a, I recently coordinated the 6-county continuum of care within the southern tier. So it was Broome, Shenango, Cortland, Delaware, Otsego, and Tioga counties. And every single county is talking about an affordable housing shortage. So that looks the same across the board. I think where the opportunities are in addressing it specifically in particular to each region comes in the aspects of, do we understand our equity metrics? Do we understand what our communities look like and the experiences of those who are most frequently experiencing displacement or housing instability? So those differences, but I think the only way, in the same way that affordable housing is lacking across the region, the best way to approach it is what has already been discussed in, are we going directly to those households and actually centering and listening to their experiences and shaping our development projects around what their needs are, rather than thinking that either we know best or having this idea about whether it's profit potential, economic opportunity. I mean, all of these things that we kind of set on top of the strategic planning process. Where are we starting and how are we intentionally shaping those projects from the outset?
Can I throw something in there as well? Is I think one of the challenges of providing that, the low income housing that might be available, that could be available, is that some of the requirements that you just can't convert, let's say, an old apartment building. If you look at the projects that are going through, you're getting 40, something like, was it 20 million for 35 units, 9 million for 10, 12 units, kind of thing, where you can build houses for the price per unit that you're coming out with, and then, or buy houses and fix them up. The question is there some kind of administrative relook or retooling that would allow you to take a house you can buy for 60,000, put 70,000 into it, and have 130,000 per unit rather than $235,000 a unit for an apartment, and then you can still reach the idea of building wealth by having it as like a homesteaded property. And that's something I was always trying to get the city to move to along the way. And I think it would be the kind of homesteaded where you're kind of building equity while you're out there. I'm sorry. I missed the beginning. I'm supposed to put the questions in the chat. I just got educated. So I will be quiet now.
That's okay. I don't know if either of you have any feedback on that, because actually we pretty much are at the end of our list of prepared questions, so that's totally okay, Bob.
Yeah, I don't have any feedback on that specifically yet. I did want to reference kind of a silver lining of some sorts. Well, what was shared was our small and mid-sized cities report. And so when it comes to more smaller communities, what we're finding is that there's greater opportunity to drive action and to actually see it into fruition. For some of these larger, more urban communities, there's just a lot of bureaucracy, so you're not able to really see action happen. And so what we found, we had an opportunity to analyze this in some cities across the US. And the biggest driver is just commitment. I think if there is a commitment and capacity, so those are two critical components, is to drive these inclusive actions when we're thinking about affordable housing. And I echo Rebecca's remarks around affordable housing is something across a multitude of communities around the nation. I've not interviewed in a district that has not had this as front and center as an issue. So I think it is a time for innovation, and it's a time for communities to lift up and say, this is what is working and this is how we're tackling it. Yet not tackling it with an equity lens is not gonna be helpful, because we've already tried it without an equity lens and look where we're at. And so some areas that I think could be supportive of local communities is enhancing, specifically rural communities, is enhancing the access to data and measurement tools that can help them lead them into these areas. So, and these are significant hurdles, specifically in smaller communities. We're also seeing that really reviewing your policy frameworks. And in many cases, what we're seeing in communities is that the policies that exist are extremely archaic in regards that they have not been revisited. And those are really the barriers. And really, through your community engagement, your community will uplift that and share, like, these are the areas that have been barriers and caused hurdles. And then the last thing I would like to share is that really finding that secret sauce on how do you create stakeholder engagement. I'm going to uplift, I know this is not a small community, but List San Diego created a really healthy accountability tool. I might drop it in the chat if I can find it, where they gathered stakeholder input and also had measurements on how their community can hold List accountable for some of those measurements. And that's a very unique process that I don't think we really see very often. And so that's what I have to have, but I'm going to pass it to Rebecca, because I'm not sure if Rebecca may have some comments about what Robert had shared.
First, so I don't forget to piggyback on the resource that you shared, Jessica. One of the most helpful resources that I have found that was, collaboratively developed nationally was the Urban Institute put together a priority index for emergency rental assistance, and it takes into account COVID-19 impact, equity, and housing instability risk, among other factors, but it goes by census tract for every census tract in the United States. And so using, as Jessica said, the data that we already have available to us, because we don't have a shortage of data. Like, none of this information is new. Some of the approaches, particularly in terms of equity, are new. I think we're still figuring out what works best, or what can be effective in approaching equitable development. Largely, maybe just because some of the language is new, but we have no shortage of data when it comes to what the highest needs are, where our significant deficits are. So it's really, largely a matter of, if we're distributing that data, then also that those mechanisms of holding leadership accountable and administrative departments accountable. And if that's not spearheaded by the local municipality, then uplifting community groups and those with lived experience to gather stakeholders, as Jessica was saying. The opportunity for accountability is significant. And when we're not only paying attention to the projects that are occurring locally, but asking questions and pushing our elected officials to ask questions, council members, county representatives. Like, there should be inquiries into whether or not a project meets an actual identified community need. And that shouldn't be, I mean, this might be idealistic, but that shouldn't be subject to political influence or one side or the other. Again, that may be a bit idealistic, but I think there's great opportunity for accountability. Bob, to some of what you were mentioning, I mean, the opportunity to incentivize affordable development, particularly within the private sector. I mean, I keep going back to this because there are federal dollars. Yes, there's significant amounts of money that are going to, 14 unit properties at multiple millions per unit because of the bureaucratic requirements and red tape of utilizing public funding. But what are we doing to incentivize affordable development within the private sector? What are we doing to legislate inclusionary zoning protocol? What are we doing to prohibit conversions and sales from existing affordable housing to student housing? How are we keeping our finger on the pulse of what the community actually needs and approaching development that way, as opposed to, largely just looking at profit potential on the other end, or hoping that the public sector is going to solve it. There's not enough state and federal funding to go around to build the units that we need of deeply affordable housing. So it's got to start happening at the private sector level, not just public.
I would say it has to be both. I think the federal government and the state government don't look at the requirements they put on the housing projects, make them extremely unaffordable and unattractive for private sector for the requirements. If you just have a straight private sector thing, they're going to try to get where the margins are. And what's happening is, because of that, you have a gap in services that results from both the incentives that both the private and public sectors are putting out. So I agree that there's a disincentive to serve that market. And I think one of the biggest ways that the government can do to serve that market is to allow for the development of, let's say, smaller, Mrs. Murphy's boarding house situations, where somebody can own a property and rent out 2 apartments in it, which doesn't get that, maintains the neighborhood. You don't have the gentrification, but you do, some of the stuff when government comes in, it creates all the circumstances that makes gentrification possible. And I guess that's my concern on that, is that if you can have homesteading where you're giving people an opportunity to develop their own property and their own wealth, I think that, and I don't have a silver bullet of an exact plan to do it, but I just think if I were to go, that's where I would be heading.
Thanks, Bob. Well, we've only got about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to, if I haven't gotten one of our questions out, I think we've covered it. So I'll turn it over to Evan, who might have some questions from the audience.
Thanks, Beth. So yeah, I think this is related to what Rebecca was just speaking on, and that is, are there currently programs which encourage or require landlords to offer a percentage of their properties to low-income families?
No, there's nothing legislated locally that incentivizes, so inclusionary zoning, reserving percentages for any level of low income, whether it's 30, 50, 80. We don't see that in municipal legislative protocol. We absolutely could. It's absolutely an opportunity that has been demonstrated effective, proven effective. So if a development project for residential or mixed use is going to move forward, why not require that 15 to 20% is reserved for extremely low income or deeply affordable housing, so that as we move projects forward, we're also accounting for the deficits that exist.
Thank you, Rebecca. Jessica, I don't know if you have anything to add in this space. Okay. A second question is, and I think this is certainly applicable to both of you, and that is, how prevalent is fair housing discrimination, and what can our municipalities do to educate landlords about their responsibilities?
I'll take the local, and then Jessica, I'm sure you have a broader perspective. I mean, we know without a doubt that fair housing discrimination, so discrimination in access to housing and stability, is extremely prevalent in particularly the city of Binghamton, but across Broome County. Even though source of income discrimination was made illegal in 2019 with the new tenant protections at the state level, we see significant source of income discrimination. We see discrimination, particularly of single parent headed households. The issue locally is we do not have a fair housing entity that covers Broome County. I'm not sure about the other regions that are represented on the call, but there is no local mechanism for fair housing enforcement. Now, protocol has been suggested for years to municipal leadership at the city and the county level that would, at a pretty low cost, expand fair housing coverage so that local residents have the opportunity to access whether it's testers to identify discrimination when it happens, or legal support if you are in fact the tenant having that experience, but we've not seen that pushed forward at municipal levels.
Broadly, what I can say is, especially during the pandemic, the lack of fair housing across the US was very prevalent. You started to see practices where to access a rental, you needed to now provide first and last month's rent and additional another. So that those deposits that you had to put in are so astronomical that in reality, it automatically isolates someone out. Credit checks on housing, all these different aspects that then specifically target specific communities are out of control. And those can easily be solved by having these types of these tenant support systems within the local government that says, like, this is the standard. This is the standard between the tenant and the landowner. These are the practices. And as we start to see more and more community-owned properties, I think that is a greater solution. So there is a little bit more voice for those who are renters. And less ways to specifically target and isolate. I think it's most important too, and I know we're coming up on time, is also to try to avoid and create programs that isolate people of color in specific income brackets. I think being very clear, and I think that's where we see the discrimination, is that we specifically say that this happens here, and so we know exactly who we're about to work with. And that's a little bit more difficult. I think that requires a little bit more of an equity lens and more support at supporting team members and how to see that and create programs that are a little bit more effective. But I think this is an area that we're gonna really need to be honest with and start to track a little bit more intentionally.
All right, well, before we conclude today's event, let me just once again thank both Jessica and Rebecca for joining us. This was a very engaging and informative conversation that I think provides an important foundation for this series going forward. Also, thank you to all of our attendees. We hope to see you again on December 16th, again at 12 o'clock, for our next discussion on aligning capital and generating impact, a conversation on commercial lending services, federal housing priorities, and innovative local initiatives. Please visit our website at southerntiersummit.com to view all of our upcoming events, and have a great afternoon.